10. Hallam was at work next morning when reception phoned. Lucy was downstairs, doubtless feeling guilty for storming out the night before. He asked for her to be shown up, then glanced over at Kate, who was at her computer. She had been studiously avoiding Hallam's glances since he came in. When Lucy appeared, Hallam rose to meet her, noticing with some satisfaction that Kate was very alert to the entrance. He grabbed the opportunity. He rushed forward, gave Lucy, by his standards, warmly fraternal kiss, and pulled her over to be introduced before Kate could bolt for the toilets. "Kate, this is my sister Lucy, the one I told you about." Both women were slightly flustered, even Lucy, but she quickly laughed and held out a hand. "I'm not as bad as he makes out." Kate hesitated, then smiled. "Have you noted the family resemblance?" inquired Hallam with a hint of "told you so." "Yeah," said Kate. "You're the ugly version. Anyway, nice to meet you, Lucy. I'd better answer that phone. I'm waiting on a call." "Bye," said Lucy. Hallam took her to his desk. "Thank you." "That's okay. Look, I'm sorry for walking out like that last night. Me turning up out of the blue and everything. Forget it." "Are you sure?" "Sure." She smiled and seemed to accept his move towards reconciliation in good faith. "Do you know your friend Alistair gave me a call at the hotel and asked me out?" "Really? That's nice of him. Did you put him up to it to get me off your hands?" "No, we might have to consider the possibility that he liked you on your own merits. He's an eccentric soul." "In what way eccentric?" "Well, let me see. He's considerate, interesting, solvent, non-alcoholic, self-assured, and now this bit's strange. He doesn't jag about." "Are you being nice to me because we're in public?" Hallam frowned and inspected his fingernails. "I didn't mean to be." "So do you think I should say yes?" Knowing her, she already had, but he thought that he ought to encourage her anyway. "No, you've hardly got anything in common. Anyway, what's the venue?" "A place called Black Bowes. Not that I've agreed yet," she added quickly. "Why don't you come along? I'm heading north the day after. I thought I might take a gander at the Highlands. I've got a date tonight." In response to her silent query about who his date was with, Hallam surreptitiously nodded in Kate's direction. This was of course untrue, but then Lucy hadn't been totally honest either. "I'll see you before you go, though." "Speak to you later, then." Lucy kissed him. Hallam even proffered his cheek. He walked her out past Kate with elaborate attentiveness. As he returned to his desk, Hallam realized that these small charades of affection were dangerous. He slipped past your defenses, too easily became real. It was funny how he could so easily handle the big things, the letter, for instance, which had given him an almost unnatural inner peace by merely confirming his suspicions, and thereby settling his most deeply held and feverishly avoided anxieties. No, it was the little things that he found the worst. Tenderness, for instance. He breathed deeply and sat down. The phone rang. Hallam sighed. "Hello, Cancer Action. Hallam Poe speaking." Silence. Hallam put a professional smile in his voice to disguise his impatience. "Hello, Cancer Action. How can I help?" "It's Gordon Carter here." Hallam had been waiting for this. "Gordon, we were informed of your loss. Can I just say how sorry we are?" "Sorry? I'm surprised you're still bothering to be insincere now that you've landed your $1,000,000. I work for a charity, Gordon. I haven't gained anything personally from this." "No, your motivation isn't anything as simple as money, is it?" "I might have been less repelled if it was." Hallam sighed audibly. This was achieving nothing. "What can I do for you?" "I'd love you to return my inheritance." "Your mother made a decision of her own free will to leave." "The courts will decide that. That's not really why I called." "The courts? Your employer will be receiving notification from my lawyers about the terms of my late mother's will, and whether she was of sound mind when she made her amendments just before her death, and indeed whether she made her decision of her own free will at all. Your methods are pretty unorthodox, Hallam. I don't know what they taught you at Newcastle University, but it certainly wasn't ethics." "What was it you studied at university, by the way?" The index finger of Hallam's left hand tapped nervously on the desk. He didn't answer. "Faux? Yes." "Did you really go to university? Because that was what you told your employers, wasn't it, when you were given your job?" "Yes." "Goodbye, Hallam." The line went dead. Kate came over. "Good work on the legacy leaflet. Your sister seemed very nice, but it was necessary to show her to me. What happened wasn't planned, Hallam." "I realize that," he said, "but it was planned," he thought. "I planned it. What I mean is, I feel as if I might have been a bit irresponsible with your feelings." Hallam's right eyebrow expressed mild surprise. "Thanks." She rushed on. "Look, you already know that I'm on the rebound with Alistair, and the fact is I still don't know how I feel about him." "That's okay, really. But you should know that I don't regret, well, I do wish I hadn't, but forget it." "No, I won't forget it because I feel privileged that you opened up in the way you did, but I'm just wondering if I was really the right person with what work and everything. Honestly, that's okay. It was a one-off." She still didn't look entirely convinced, so he put a twist of resentment in his voice. "Look, if you remember, I did have my own slight misgivings. She blinked hard as if to force back the embarrassment. Of course, sorry. I'm more worried about you, he continued, softer now. What's the matter? She chewed her lip anxiously. Do you mind me talking like this about him? Not at all, so long as you don't mind me keeping out of it, if you know what I mean. She groaned with pent-up frustration. It's just he's been calling me constantly, and I've been putting him off, but now the has suddenly gone cold on me, and I'm angry for caring, but I'm just wondering if he's seeing someone else. And if he was, what then? You'd want him back even more? No, believe me, I don't want him back. Maybe I want back what I thought he was. Not who he is, or at least who I think he is. If he's seeing someone now, then I think in the end it's going to help me move on. Do you see? He nodded in what he imagined was the concerned but detached manner of a sensible friend. Oh crap, I'm so sorry. Pile all of this on you. She dropped a hand on his shoulder where it lay for a moment. Come on, let's forget it and sink a couple after work. Hallam's face brightened, but then he made a little tut as if remembering. I can't do that, I'm afraid. I'm seeing Lucy this evening. Oh, of course, sorry. Kate suddenly looked embarrassed. Oh, please, don't think. Oh, no, I'll shut up. She turned and went back to her desk in disarray. He phoned the restaurant. Hi, I'm just phoning to check what time the dinner's been booked for this evening. The name's Cruikshank. 8:30? Of course, thanks. My mind's a sieve. For two, that's right. The car park was opposite the restaurant and set back from the road. On the second story, Hallam watched through his laches as Alasdair arrived on time. He paused at the glass door, then went inside, turning briefly to shut it behind him. He seemed to have a little trouble with the handle because he stood there for a moment, and Hallam could not be sure whether he was also taking the opportunity to look out. Either way, he was met by a waiter who showed him to the table, which was, as a chance or design would have it, reserved right by the window. Hallam was afforded a perfect view, even if the place filled up. Alasdair sat and filled absent-mindedly with a napkin, and waited for 15 minutes that it took Lucy to arrive. She had dressed casually for the occasion, trousers as usual, a close-fitting cotton top, hair messy but attended to. They smiled and kissed, and Alasdair ordered some wine. It was 8:49. Hallam recorded it in his pocket notebook. He took a couple of photos with the aid of a zoom lens that he returned to observing the chatting couple through the laches. The minutes passed, and his terse recording spilled out one page, then two. He noted such details as a hand touching another on the table, the ordering of a second bottle of wine, Lucy going to the ladies. Yet Hallam realized that he was losing his touch. He had watched the process of seduction many times, usually with disdain for the coyness and clowning, the faux earnestness of the men, and the slow cow-like blinks that denoted female encouragement, but now he could see his detachment was corrected by having been through this nightmarish game himself. He kept having to remind himself that he was watching Alasdair and his sister and not himself and Kate. He felt surges of protectiveness and hatred, envy, and a sort of engaged fascination in the outcome of the evening. In comparison to this, the previous encounters he had observed in various corners and apartments of Old Town were cheap soap operas. There was no entertainment or escapism in this. He both feared and desired a successful outcome. The couple's conversation beyond the glass window was unimportant. It was in their bodies. Alasdair's bunched back as he stirred his coffee, Lucy's playful toes dangling her shoe under the table, their languid glances toward one another. All of it drew Hallam to one irrefutable conclusion: the plan was working. Alasdair ordered the bill. Hallam went on ahead and positioned himself on the roof of a tenement across the road from the 4-star Ramparts Hotel, a Scottish baronial building halfway down the Royal Mile. Lucy's room was on the 3rd floor. She never skimped with traveling expenses. It was a peculiar expression of pride, Hallam thought, for someone whose job, despite the association with gems, only paid a modest wage. Perhaps Julius had managed to slip her some more cash on her visit, another compelling incentive for reconciliation that naturally she had not lowered herself to mention. As Hallam expected, the couple went directly up to her room, not even pausing to take in a drink at the hotel bar. He reflected sourly that Cambridge had taught Lucy something more sophisticated than playing hard to get. He was trying to fire his resentment of his sister, but all he could muster were petty grudges and observations that in another context might have been almost affectionate. As soon as the light went on, she stood in the window for a moment, unwittingly allowing him to frame her with 3 or 4 good shots. Then he crouched down to inspect the contents of the minibar. Alasdair stood near the window too, smiling at something. She said the room couldn't be very big, however swanky the hotel. She sat down out of sight in what must be the bed. Hallam caught him too, with the zoom, fairly clearly. If only he could get the pair of them together for a truly incontrovertible image. Lucy stood up again and sloped across the window with a couple of small spirit bottles, chatting away nervously, it seemed. She turned to sit down, but his hands reached around her waist and pulled her down on him. She jackknifed and fell backwards out of sight. Hallam saw nothing for a while, just the flash of a bare elbow, then the flick of a blonde bob. He waited. 6 minutes later he saw Alistair stand up naked. He held out both hands and pulled Lucy off the bed into his arms. She was down to her underwear. This was Hallam's opportunity. He took one exposure, then another as they kissed. But then Alistair suddenly twisted her round. It must have surprised her, because he could see a look of vague alarm in her face as he pushed her up against the window, bending her down with one forearm around her waist, and the fingers of his other hand thrust up the nape of her neck. Either she was in pain or experiencing visceral pleasure. Pleasure, Hallam told himself, shaking as he took one more shot. But then he stopped as her neck seemed to bend painfully against the window pane. He let the camera fall from his hands and swing from his neck as he groped for the binoculars and trained them on the target. Pain. Soon afterwards, Lucy was pulled from the window. She flopped out of sight, discarded. Alistair was left there, panting. After gathering himself together, he came right up to the hotel window. His genitals flushed but spent, stood for a moment with a hand on each hairy hip as if admiring the city observatory against the dark blue sky. He looked invigorated, pleased with himself. Hallam counted the seconds. 1 minute 15, and the naked figure of Lucy flitted behind him on her way to the bathroom, clutching a towel to her front, causing Alistair to glance round and smile. But then, presumably, she shut the door behind her, because Alistair dropped to his look of casual satisfaction and became serious. He returned his gaze to the window. He seemed to be staring out intently, but no longer at the sky, more in the direction of Hallam, although there was no way that he could be seen from his vantage point. Slowly and deliberately, Alistair nodded. Alistair moved away from the window and getting dressed when 2 small tears fell from behind the leashes and skimmed Hallam's cheeks. His unblinking gaze was still fixed to the shaking eyepieces, even as the yellow-lit window started swimming in his vision. He had found his opposite. They had connected. His obsession had been stated to the point with self-disgust. With Alistair's assistance and the letter, everything had changed. He could leave it all behind now, couldn't he? He had horrified himself, but there was pride, too. He told himself that his business was almost done here, and that a new, even more challenging path was unfurling before him, with an objective that it was his absolute duty to carry through. Hallam had observed all his life. Now he decided it was time to act. Hallam walked into the office at 9:28 a.m., with a satchel under his arm. Kate was looking worried. She had been watching the entrance, waiting for him to come in. He went straight over to her desk. "Hallam, we just received some bad news." His grin was sickly. "I bet mine is worse." "It's not a joke, Hallam. We received a writ about the Carter bequest." "That's not used. This is." He pulled a large brown envelope out of his satchel and dropped it on her desk. "Go on," he said. Kate opened the envelope. She pulled out a sheaf of enlarged photos and began to flip through them. Her frown slowly fell away. Her whole face lost animation. Hallam placed the notebook down next and opened it for her at the relevant pages. "My observations," he said dryly. He then delved into his satchel, looking for his letter of resignation. "Is that Alistair and Lucy, my sister, indeed?" Kate put down the photos and hardly bothered to look through his notes. Instead, she twisted her chair around to face him. "This may sound predictable, but why?" Hallam still couldn't find his letter. "Don't worry, I don't want anything from you. I wasn't expecting you to forget Alistair or to fall for me. In that case, I'd have sent you those anonymously, although I expect you might have guessed anyway. Whatever. I just wanted you to see that he's wrong for you, that you can leave him behind now. And also," Hallam's voice started to shake, despite his best efforts, "and also that I'm wrong for you as well, that I'm a pervert, that you should stay away from me." "What are you talking about? It doesn't matter." "Oh, sod it." Hallam gave up looking for the letter, which he had carefully worded the night before, and grabbed a pen from Kate's desk. The sudden movement caused her to push herself back in her chair. He noted her repulsion and felt self-pity blossom as he scrawled, "I resign," across the back of a newsletter. He signed it with a dramatic flourish, then made for the door. "Where are you going?" He paused and did not turn around. "I'm going home." "11. On his way back to the flat, Hallam stopped at a chemist to buy a bottle of bikini-line depilatory cream, the strongest I had. After that, he went to a corner shop where he bought a packet of the very cheapest sausages he could find. He was disappointed that none were past their sell-by date, and had to settle instead for an 8-pack of only vaguely suspect economy chipolatas. At the flat, he put his purchases in a black rucksack, along with some dark clothes and his usual abseiling equipment. To these he added a sleeping bag, a ground mat, and a water bottle. What else? A screwdriver, some tight-lever gloves, a small can of oil. He opened a large drawer and took out his old camo jacket, which lay rolled up in the back. It had stiffened and become moth-eaten after years of neglect, and on reflection Hallam decided to dump it in the rubbish bag. He would buy a new one before catching the train. However, he remembered to take from the jacket's inside pocket the big ring of keys for the hall. Utility was foremost in his mind on his trip. There was no room for sentiment, and immediately he was tempted by it. Hallam peered further into the recesses of the drawer and dug out a plastic bag. Carefully he emptied it and flopped the old badger pelt. He stroked the slightly balding snout thoughtfully, and put it in the rucksack also. It would be his one indulgence. The phone started to ring. Hallam waited for the answering machine to pick it up. After a scratchy recorded message, Lucy came on the line. "Hi, Hallam, it's Lucy here. Just tried you at work, but someone said you had gone home. Hope you're okay. I thought you might want to know all about my hot date last night. You're right. He is a bit eccentric. Give me a call at the hotel or I'll try you later. Bye." She sounded sunny, entirely normal, completely divorced, it seemed, from the wrinkled-up face which he had seen pressed against the window-pane of the ramparts, a face made stupid and brutish by the sexual act. How it degraded people, including himself. Once again Hallam cursed himself for the string of compromises that had arisen out of his obsession with Kate, and he reflected briefly on the repercussions it had on those around him. His sister's unwitting prostitution for his own ends, Alasdair's discovery of his inner exhibitionist, and Gordon's disinheritance to the tune of $1,000,000. His conscience undulated beneath these thoughts, but was soon stilled as he threw himself back into the tasks of organizing his departure. He washed the dirty dishes and threw his bed linen in the washing machine. He wiped surfaces and scoured scurf. He performed detailed cleaning tasks with cotton wool buds. Finally, he stacked his now voluminous collection of logbooks in the drawer, which he locked, then vigorously buffed. At the front door, he looked behind him at the flat he was leaving. He wondered at the mildly pathological behavior that caused people to tidy and purge their homes before a period of absence, the fear that things left untended might decay and attract vermin. This was the problem with his life. He had left his past behind without having it scoured and purged. Things had gone bad. His task was to return and put these matters right, slightly admonishing his gloomy thoughtfulness, a trait which he was increasingly growing to despise in himself as a form of dithering. Hallam drew himself back to business and action. He did not forget to pick up his binoculars before locking the flat. He arrived at the train station, the point of his departure half a decade before, in the late afternoon. He stepped onto the platform and walked through the Grand Victorian building, past the Barkham Hotel, which had not changed, towards the centre, which had developments had sprung up everywhere. He saw a new shopping centre here, fresh roads and flyover there, more prosperity in every direction. He was in his hometown, a modestly resurgent provincial city, content with himself, alien. At the bus station, Hallam took the extra precaution of using the main bus route to Milton, rather than the rural service, which could have taken him through Chambly itself. The single-decker lurched through the traffic until 20 minutes later the congestion eased. Hallam jumped off the large, sprawling village of Cold Satchville, already paranoid that a passing driver might recognize him, although the face would have been unfamiliar to most locals even 5 years ago, so seldom had he ventured outside the grounds. He sat in a pub that was just opening its doors to the early evening punters. He had chosen it specifically for its long-standing local reputation for being both busy and unfriendly. The road it sat on was heavily used by lorries, and the passing trade meant that the staff was indifferent to strange faces. He sat in the corner and waited for dusk. He consumed a brick of lasagna and sipped carefully at 2 pints of anonymous keg lager. His rucksack was stashed unostentatiously behind him under a table and was ignored by the few regulars who congregated mainly around the fruit machine. And in the pool room next door, the banality of the surroundings soothed away Hallam's nerves about re-entering the forbidden territory just a few miles to the west. He briefly considered the situation back in Edinburgh. The prospects of a legal challenge to the bequest, the chances of damaging press coverage, and the exposure of his fictitious CV, which would surely scupper his career in the charity sector. None of it seemed terribly important. Indeed, he already felt marvelously unfettered sitting in his grotty boozer, and raw freedom conferred beauty. Even the manic thrill of the fruit machine and the chipped green ashtray and the sweep of the fireproof burgundy curtains. These commonplaces were a blessing to him now, as brief respite from his exotic mission, whose objective he still doubted he could achieve for reasons both operational and personal. Retribution was still an unfamiliar concept to him, and he shrank from the responsibility, but it was clear. Why else would his mother have written him that letter? It was right to know the truth, but she had taken the step. She had made no mention of revenge, that was true, but what needed was there to give him instructions, unless she thought him a coward. He felt ashamed that he had delayed reading the letter for so long, and for entertaining these doubts. Noticing that it had grown dark, Hallam slunk the rucksack over his shoulder and left the pub. He took the right turn away from the lights of the main road and up the hill heading west. Just beyond the last red brick farmhouse, he jumped over the roadside ditch and shoved his way through a gap in the hedge and then over a loose barbed wire fence. A dog barked and he glanced toward the lights shining from the farmhouse. The barking stopped. He quickly crossed the fallow field, jogging his way in the direction of Chamby. When a car motored by in the opposite direction, he lay flat on the grass as an extra precaution. The beams of its headlamps were dispersed by the hedge and only dimly illuminated the undulating field beyond. He stood up, brushed himself down, and was on his way again. He found that he was beginning to enjoy himself, the warmth of exercise coursing through him, the mild southerly climate, and the smell of trees on the wind, all induced an ambivalent nostalgia for his early youth. He was glad to be back as an adult. An hour and a half later, he paused to rest in a spinney just beyond the outskirts of Rigby, a small hamlet made up of 4 bunched cottages and a straggling outhouse. It was 10:17. He approached Chanby by curving round and coming in from the south, thereby keeping a distance both from the road and the line of houses that marked the beginnings of the village. This way he could cross the main street in a patch of relative darkness and quickly find cover in the meadow at the bottom of the grounds. Hallam liked being diverted by these practical considerations. However, his excitement was slowly being replaced by a nagging sense of disbelief that he was actually intending to go ahead with his plans. He suppressed it and pushed on, reminding himself to be wary of the closing time traffic. Not that there would be much of it in a sleepy corner of the country. If he was cautious, he reminded himself, he need not commit himself any further than he felt ready to go. The only serious risk of being seen was from the Pinkerton Arms, which popped into view through a strand of dead elms. A crack of light was barely visible due to the landlord's habit of keeping the curtains tightly drawn to avoid the attention of any police car might object to lock-ins. From behind the elms, Hallam saw that the pub car park was empty. He knew that he ought to wait another hour to be safe, but he was so close. Was he imagining it, or could he see the dark smudge of the grounds trees beyond the meadow? He stared into the darkness until his eyes hurt, but the geography of the grounds was indelible in his mind. Gatewatch to the left, lower point away to the right, their pull was irresistible. He was then crouching in a field opposite the old local that Hallam experienced a second and more profound sense of homecoming. It was not an invigorating rush like the first, but more a sense of context, of remembering that he was the product of a family and a place. He cast his eyes around him. Very little had changed. But there was no reassurance in these familiar surroundings. Hallam preferred the anonymity of the city. The village's sedative atmosphere was to be fought at all costs. With cool professionalism, he hopped over the barbed wire fence, crossed the road in 10 or 11 steps, and vaulted over the wall that marked the hall's traditional boundary. He lay flat behind it for a few seconds in what appeared to be dry horse poop. He listened for a moment of any sign of having been spotted. Nothing. He was in. He lifted himself up on one elbow and checked the road both ways. Empty, only the faint hum of the traffic accelerating up a far hill. Then, just as he was getting to his feet, he heard footsteps on the pavement emerging from around the corner. Quickly, Hallam dropped down against the wall. It had been built over 100 years ago without mortar, according to the local custom, and the bricks bulged out precariously over the pavement. To his horror, it seemed to totter from the impact of his rucksack and shoulder. Hallam put his hands over his head. The wall steadied. He breathed again. The footsteps came closer, heavy, plodding, as if snow-clad. They were drunks returning home on automatic. Hallam concluded, a theory backed up by the lugubrious silence that had first unnerved him slightly. The patter of the small dog's paws could also be heard. A loud belch resonated only feet away. That would be a sign, Pig City, observed one of them. The county's elastic valves pulled Hallam straight back to 17. You what? The boy sloppy content. A saying of my uncle's. Get your nose out of it, Reg. Hallam prayed that Reg had not detected the economy chipolatas, but the dog's owner's impatience saved him. Reg was dragged away with a hoarse gasp and a scrape of claws on asphalt. Hallam waited for their footsteps to fade and then allowed himself to peer over the wall at two departing pedestrians who were heading for the small housing estate further along. When they had disappeared out of sight, he at last made his way up the meadow, passing close by the spot that Ginny had once frequented, which now lay empty. Hallam smiled faintly at the memory of all the logbook entries that these few square feet of cover had spawned. When he looked up, there he could see the trees clearly now, and he could even hear the breeze in the upper branches of Lower Point. He climbed over a second barbed wire fence and swiftly strode up the public footpath, confident that he would not meet anyone coming the other way this time. On his left he noticed the hedge that bordered the hall's bottom lawns and had grown still higher and thicker, and that a wooden fence had been installed to prevent anyone on the path from seeing in. There was graffiti on the slats. At the top of the path he emerged beside the war memorial facing the cemetery. In the center of it, Chanby Parish Church continued to prod its stump at the sky. The question was how to get up there. He quickly scouted the cemetery. It was empty, quiet, and clean, not even a beer can in sight. He went straight to the church entrance and tried the thick oak door. The heavy circular iron handle would not budge. It was locked as he had expected. He would have to scale the wall, despite the backpack, which was heavier load than he usually contended with. Returning to the tower at the end of the church, he looked up, hands on hips. The copper lightning rod ran up the weather vane, passing a gargoyle through whose gaping mouth he could see a smudge of the night sky. That was no help. He could either try and lasso one of the crenellations on the first tier of the roof or attempt to lead drain pipe on the near side. He opted for the former. The pipe looked too spindly for comfort. He aimed for a crenellation near the buttress, so that the rope would be hanging in deep shadow if anyone walked past. He tied his end of the rope to the rucksack and climbed up. Once he was on the roof, he pulled the rucksack up behind him, keeping a close eye on all the time the cemetery gate that led into the estate's main road. He then climbed to the ridge of the church roof and used the same method to scale the square tower. He pulled the rucksack up over the low wall and placed it against the base of the steeple. There was about a foot of space, just enough to lie on out of sight. He thought about organizing his things in preparation for a night's sleep, but he could not resist the temptation to take a preliminary look at the grounds. Slithering back down the rope, he loped off along the hall's private path and disappeared into the shadows of the trees. He opened the gate cautiously to ensure that it did not creak, for despite being surrounded by shrubbery, Hallam was aware of how far the noise could carry, conceivably up to the master bedroom where Verity and Julius might already be sleeping. He padded past the towering Wellingtonia, with its shabby thatch of drooping branches, towards the stables. Alice was the same too. He backed into the narrow passageway between the stables and cottage, carefully checking the windows at the back of the hall for light. There was none. The moment was approaching, his first view of the lakeland. Hallam stepped softly, yet he could hear the echoes of his feet and heart as he came to the passageway's arched mouth. Then he stood, forgot all good intentions of stealth, and gaped. What lay in front of him was a large building site. This he had been prepared for, but in the middle of the mud, cement mixtures, and concrete foundations stood an outlandish edifice, a huge metal mast shaped like a V, with two satellite dishes adorning each finger. As the clouds slid by above, dim moonshine fell upon the obscenely defiant installment, causing its dishes to glint like knuckle dusters. The contraption took Hallam's breath away. It was beyond offensive. He stepped forward as if on stilts and began to take in the devastation surrounding it, the shimmer of windows in a long, wide pit. Some kind of environmentally friendly burrow, he supposed, what the papers had called Hobbitland all those years ago. Around the edges of the site were a few freshly planted conifers, and to the right, where the long grass and lakes had once spread to the horizon under the shadow of Center Point, was an expanse of nothing, flat, uninterrupted turf on a gentle, sterile incline. Hallam's stunned gaze returned inevitably to the 20-foot V. He moved his feet slightly, making a soft sucking noise in the mud, and simultaneously a large piece of board covering a ditch some few feet in front of him suddenly rose up and disgorged a black-clad figure who pelted across the mud and leapt at him. The figure's shoulder rammed Hallam straight in the solar plexus and sent him flying backwards. He hit the ground with jarring force. His assailant gripped him tightly round the waist. Hallam struggled to breathe as a rough, palmed hand grabbed him by the throat, and a heavy pair of knees pinned down his arms. Looking up through his watering eyes, he could see a fist raise up to strike as he tried in vain to twist away. Violent assault was so intimate, Hallam reflected in that long, slow moment as he prepared for impact, and not even an introduction. Half a second passed and his nasal septum was still intact. Another half second. "Who are you, then?" Hallam writhed again, but he was well and truly pinned. He looked up at the face of the man, who was wearing a woolly hat and an almost comical look of surprise. "Hallam?" the man said. "Carl," Hallam coughed and gasped. "Good evening to you. Nobody told me you were coming back. Get off me." Carl rolled off and stood up, confused and embarrassed. "Nobody told you," said Hallam with difficulty, clutching his guts and trying to sit up, "because nobody knows." The two of them sat and drank in turn from Carl's thermos of sweet tea, regarding the satellite mast. "Your father calls it the Salute," explained Carl, "but for the record, it's meant to provide the underground village with a satellite signal when the residents eventually move in. If there ever are any." "Why did he have to make it so big?" "A practical work of art is what he calls it. In fact, it's to wind up the locals who oppose the development. There's no planning permission for it. He'll have to pull it down, I expect." "Since when has he been into art?" Carl shrugged. "Modernism and progress defying conservative backward thinking," he said, the neutral monotone suggesting that it was a quotation from his employer. Hallam sucked in his breath. "You must love it." "The clever bit, supposedly, is that apparently the two-finger gesture originated with English archers who taunted the French knights at Agincourt and Crécy with it, because if the archers were ever caught, the French would cut off those two fingers so they wouldn't be able to pull back a bowstring again." Carl took a slurp of tea. "Funny stance for a landowner to take, isn't it? But there you go." "Has there been a lot of trouble about this development, then?" "It hasn't stopped ever since." Carl hesitated. "Ever since you went away. There have been kids coming in here, vandalizing the site, nicking stuff. They even took to smashing up the plants and spraying graffiti. It was the townies to begin with, the ones that demonstrated anyway, but there's locals too. They've changed the locks up at the hall. A bit paranoid, if you ask me. It's only teenagers." "Have you been sitting in that ditch all night waiting to ambush someone?" Carl shrugged. "There's one little bugger in particular I'm after. I've got my suspicions who it is. Anyway, I've made it quite comfy down there. Nice to have a bit of peace and quiet." "Have you got a girlfriend?" asked Hallam. "No, mate. Married." Hallam threw his head back and cackled. "Don't tell me. Jenny." Carl's face shut down. "That's right, and you better watch your mouth." Hallam's grin faded into incredulity, and then something more respectful. "Sorry, Carl, I didn't mean—" "That's all right," Carl quickly interrupted. "Just leave it." "Right, so she forgave you then?" Carl raised his voice. "I said leave it." "Kids?" Carl scowled. "Not yet. She doesn't want them." "What are you doing back here, then? Visiting the folks?" "Not exactly. Like I said, Carl, they don't know I dropped by, and I don't want you to mention it." "I'm sure they won't ask. Where are you staying?" "Nearby." "For how long?" Hallam shrugged and scratched his ear. "I take it Verity and Julius are in at the moment. They hardly leave in case the neighbors get up to something. I'm on full alert when they're out, like tomorrow morning. She's off to the hairdresser's, and he's got an appointment with the council. Julius said if there's any surveyors or other officials turn up, then I'm to phone him on his mobile right away. He's paranoid they're going to send people and then to tear the mast down." "Does he still have the same secretary?" "No, Nicola left years ago now. They've had a few since." "That'll be Verity." "I wouldn't know," muttered Carl, direct as ever. He tossed away his tea and got up. "Well, I'm off. It seems pretty quiet tonight. What are you up to?" Hallam glanced up the hill. "I might take a wander around." "You'll not find much up there, yet." Hallam didn't want to think about it any more tonight. "Night, Carl." Carl tightened his thermos and then stopped to face up to Hallam. "You probably know what they were saying about the spiking of that tree. It wasn't you, was it?" "Thanks for not assuming, Carl." Hallam wasn't answering any more questions. "You're up to something. I can feel it off you. Nothing that will affect you. It's the grounds I care about. Your dad's big ideas, they're all right, but me, I believe in stewardship, looking after what's there. Your granddad, for instance, he only bought the place after the war for the lead piping, knocked down 2 wings of a whole floor for it, but he did it responsibly for a scrap merchant. It was all ugly Victorian additions he got rid of, and now it's back to its original Queen Anne shape. That's all right, that's got style. In fact, that's what I'm interested in doing with these grounds. I know you might hate me for this, but I reckon they were right to get rid of those lakes. They were too far gone, and that oak, it was coming down sooner or later. Anyway, sometimes you have to let it go." "Thanks for the bracing folk wisdom, Carl." Hallam's voice was cold. "Send my regards to the wife." Carl scowled. "Don't do anything stupid, Hallam." With that, he turned and trudged away down the back drive. Hallam sneered briefly, then turned and looked up the desolate incline. Carl wouldn't volunteer anything to Julius about him being here. Far too loyal, that man. Hallam woke up with the dawn, and his first sight on opening his eye was the church's ancient sandstone masonry just a few inches from his nose. He closed his eyes again and shifted his weight off his shoulder, which must have been bruised last night by Carl. Still not too uncomfortable, the low wall had sheltered him from the chilly breeze, and he'd only woken up once in the night during a light shower. He stretched out and smiled. He felt privileged to be lying here at the base of the stump, almost certainly the first person to have slept here in all the building's 500 or 600 years. He rolled around in his sleeping bag under the tarpaulin and hitched up the ground mat. He patted down the rucksack to make it more comfortable pillow, and then lay on his back to face the light blue sky which was being traversed by plump, unthreatening clouds. He breathed in the moist, clean air of early morning and listened to the birds. Their calls soothed him, reminded him of summer days in Center Point, and he dozed again until the first audible coo of one of Verity's doves, which immediately caused him to tense as if woken by an alarm clock. Hallam checked his watch. It was 7:15. He reached into the rucksack and fished out his laces. Moving over to the wall, he swept the larger part of the front lawns, the east side of the hall, and the visible stretch of the drive as well. He pulled out his logbook and pen. Although he was aware that a documentary record of the next few days might conceivably present legal hazards in months to come, he decided that posterity demanded some kind of testimony. Slipping the notebook in a pocket, he pulled on his new camo jacket, gathering up the equipment that he would be needing today. Let's see now. Rancid smelling chipolatas, depilatory cream, balaclava, gloves, oil can, mobile phone, hall keys, and dropped down onto the roof, and from there to the ground below. 7:46, builders arrive in lorry. 7:55, Carl arrives in the same old Astra. 8:23, builders start work, the last drill. 8:36, Verity, first sighting, hair still long for now, and Carl at top of lawn, discussion of her herbaceous border. 8:49, small car arrives. Secretary, old frumpish V's choice. 2 pages later. 3:15, dark blue Jaguar, Julius leaves. 3:48, Carl mowing bottom lawn, foul mood. 4:06, Verity leaves. Hair appointment, silver BMW, new model. Hallam was positioned in the shrubbery below gate watch as the BMW disappeared with Verity's trademark solo blink of the indicator. Hallam noticed that the gate watch, along with the other lookout posts, had been liberated from the platforms and tree houses. Still, at least the trees had survived. Hallam wondered if Verity would have simply car-parked the whole grounds by now if it were not for Carl. With that bitter and quite possibly unreasonable thought, he took out his mobile phone and waited for Carl to make his pass at the tractor mower before he dialed the number to the florist in Cold Satchville. "Good morning," said Hallam. "I wonder if you could make a delivery within the next hour to Chamby Hall in Chamby?" "You could? Excellent. How much can I get for 200 pounds? Is the credit card okay? And the sender's name is absolutely confidential? Excellent. Lilies, can you also include a message? It goes as follows: from a secret admirer, with love." His next problem was access to the hall itself. Carl's news that the locks had been changed was a major worry, but there was one access point Hallam guessed they might have overlooked. The first thing was to reach the hall without being spotted by Carl, who had probably chosen to mow the front lawns this afternoon, specifically so that he could keep an eye on the drive. Hallam was pinned down until he took a break. It took Carl a further 43 minutes to fill the trailer with grass cuttings, by which time Hallam was beginning to worry that Verity or Julius might return and ruin all his plans. He could dodge the secretary, who was unlikely to stray far from the office orangery, but the risks rose exponentially if anyone else was inside. At last Carl hefted the grass bucket to the trailer and emptied it onto the conical mound of grass cuttings, then flattened it down with larger circular motions of his hands. There was love in those movements. He hopped onto the mini-tractor and towed away the trailer towards the compost heap at the back, leaving a fine cloud of green and brown fragments that tumbled through the gray diesel fumes. Hallam sniffed long and hauntingly. It was the smell of the early days. But this was his chance. He put on his black balaclava and thin leather gloves to avoid fingerprints or detection if security cameras were about. Although in truth he rather liked the SAS chic of it. Once Carl was away round the curve of the drive, Hallam made his dash, sprinting past the drive side lamps, 3, 4, 5, going from rhododendron bush to detested rhododendron bush. How they flourished! He trotted around to the front, reassured by the fading sound of the tractor, but still feeling exposed as he went by the hall's main door. He hung back at the corner, checking in this case if the secretary was about. Her car was parked there at the back, alongside Carl's. Hallam was shaking. He was so close, the power of the place was bearing down on him. There was the metal lid to the old coal chute, with the same padlock still attached. Glancing all around him, Hallam ran up to it and made a quick inspection. It was spotted with rust, but he was counting on the internal mechanism still working. He pulled out the can that he kept with him for stubborn locks in Edinburgh tenements, squirted some inside. Then he pulled out the keys, quickly selected a chub. With shaking hands, tried it. It wouldn't fit. Tried another. Not that one either. He glanced behind him, trying to suppress the first intimations of real fear. How many minutes before Carl came back? 4? 5? He tried another. It got halfway through and seemed to jam. He thrust it further inside. Hallam thought he could hear the tractor engine coming. Hadn't Carl even taken a cigarette break? What kind of fool enjoyed his job like that? Hallam wiggled the key furiously, and at last it slid home. He turned it and the lock opened. Flushing with relief, he tore off the padlock and shoved it in his pocket. The tractor was coming closer. He stuck his fingers underneath the lid and pulled again. It creaked. The back door of the hall opened. Disaster. The secretary. With the full force of panic, Hallam dragged up the lid and squeezed himself feet first into the blackness, pulling the rucksack with him. His jacket snagged on the lid. He heard the hall's telephone ring, a woman's soft curse, and the door shut again. He scrambled on the chute, his plimsolls briefly gaining purchase, long enough for him to free his jacket and lowered the lid above his head. Hallam glimpsed the red smear of the tractor on its return journey, just as his rubber-soled toes slipped on the dusty chute, and he went rolling down with an ominous rumble into the bowels of the hall. He dropped out of the chute feet first, but landed jarringly on his backside on a low mound of coal. He lay still for a moment and allowed himself a groan of pain, then shifted, causing the coal to crunch, and rubbed his coccyx. He paused again, listening for any sound from above that might suggest the secretary or someone else had heard anything. Nothing, or so it seemed. It was almost entirely dark in the cellar and cold, but he remembered its layout well enough. He groped for the rucksack and found the torch. The thin, strong beam revealed the cellar pretty much as he had seen it 5 years before. Brickwork blackened by dust, the far section of the cellar separated by iron bars, behind which loomed Julius's collection of wines and ports, some of which had allegedly been laid down for Hallam's 21st birthday. Hallam got up and tried the gate. It creaked open. Careless of Hallam, very careless. He could liberate some of his inheritance later. He began stealthily to climb the narrow stone steps that led, he remembered, to a small room adjoining the main hallway. But then he stopped and flicked the torch beam over himself. He was coated in coal dust. He would leave a ridiculously obvious trail. There was only one thing for it. He mounted the top and tried the door, which was locked. He selected a key from the ring. It fitted, but inserting it prodded out another key, which fell and tinkled to the floor from the other side. He waited. He opened the door and rotated a glance, slow, measured. At that moment a loud bell went off, a long, jangling note from the other side of the wall, so close that he could hear the judder of the electric motor beneath the ring. He snapped the door shut, only to realize, of course, the doorbell. It had to be loud to be heard from all corners of the sound-absorbing hall. The flowers must have arrived. Reopening the door a crack, Hallam listened to the secretary as she went to the door and opened it. A brief conversation, a gasp of admiration, a laugh, and then the approach of 2 sets of footsteps. "Why don't you put those there on the table, and those over there for now? There's more to come," said the man. Hallam began to undress, keeping an ear trained on their progress. By the time he was down to his underpants, socks, and balaclava, the delivery was completed. He heard the florist's van reverse and drive away. While he waited for the secretary to return to work in the office, Hallam took out the necessary equipment from his rucksack. He placed a screwdriver on the tiled floor alongside the depilatory cream and rancid chipolatas, which were now discolored and slippery in their transparent plastic packaging. One sock off and then another, and he stepped carefully into the hall proper. The chilly tiles sent goosepimples up his thighs. Last of all, he pulled off the balaclava and gloves. These he placed on the dusty pile of clothes just within the cellar door, which he then softly shut. He picked up his equipment and tiptoed in his pants to the hallway. He glanced left and right. The secretary was talking away on the phone, praying that the alarm system was not active in the rest of the house. He sashayed with elegant haste through the pots and buckets of white lilies, red roses too, some thorns just slightly grazing him, as he hopped off the floorboards and up the broad carpeted stairs. He couldn't stop himself from sniggering at the thought of what havoc those pollen-spewing flowers would play with Verity's allergy. At the top he looked around in surprise at the entirely new decor, the striped French upholstery, the patterned turquoise wallpaper, what looked like 18th century cupboards, all of it incredibly expensive and in Hallam's eyes hideous. Thank God he had taken off his clothes. Every footstep would have indelibly marked the plush-pale carpets. It was as if Verity had mummified the hall of his memory in silks and ribbons and plump settees. On he went, heading directly for the master bedroom, more specifically, the ensuite bathroom. Verity had surpassed herself in the bedroom. It was an orgy of cushions and flouncy pillow covers, dominated naturally by a large mahogany four-poster bed. Hallam had always been surprised that a woman of her reserved character, and he knew what reserves, should be so lush and velvety in her interiors. Perhaps this was because his imagination stopped short of her interior life, although it did seem logical that she had one. There was calculation, of course, and sex, but the rest, conscience, a past? Hallam realized that he knew virtually nothing about her past. He saw a large ceramic tray on the dresser, which contained spare sets of keys. Hallam looked quickly through them. Keys were always useful, and dug one out of the Jaguar keyring. Onto the bathroom, where a large cast-iron bath stood in the corner of the whitewashed wooden floor, flanked on all sides by full-length mirrors. In these mirrors, Hallam saw his own reflection from top to bony bottom. His eyes and wrists were encircled by black coal dust, which about its own way through the balaclava's eye-holes and between his cuffs and gloves. Together with his scrawny body, clad only in discolored white pants, he resembled something pitiful and half-starved, a skunk perhaps. Hallam suppressed his doubts by concentrating on the job at hand. He found 2 shampoo bottles, one with matching conditioner. The first was a standard brand, Julie's as he presumed, the other a dermatologically tested, studio-developed, probably super-expensive hair cleanser which could only be Verity's. Everybody has a physical focus for their vanity, and hers were those thick, soft locks. The bottle of conditioner was nearly full. Hallam unscrewed the top and poured about 1/3 of the transparent, lightly fragrant contents away down the basin. Then, with scientific delicacy, he flipped open the depilatory cream and transferred the same amount to the conditioner bottle. The consistency of the liquids did not exactly match, but it would do. Hallam rescrewed the bottle and shook it before placing it back in position outside the bath. Next for the shower rail. This was a more difficult and time-consuming job, but Hallam considered it worth the trouble, for it was, in his opinion, the most ingenious and subtle of the plagues he was arranging. First he opened the sausage packet, which gave off the rich, sweet odor of rotting offal. Taking up the screwdriver, he climbed up on the sides of the bath and began to unscrew one end of the shower rail from the wall. This did not take long. In fact, one screw came loose more quickly than he expected and dropped down into the bathtub, rattling down towards the plug hole. He got his foot in halfway just in time. Letting out a jittery sigh, he retrieved the screw, then took up the chipolatas, one by one, grimacing. He fed the slimy suppositories into the end of the shower rail, poking them along with the aid of the screwdriver. A bit of steam from the bath or shower would really get them hunking. Hallam had picked up this idea from an irresponsible internet site during an idle hour at work. The author had suggested prawns, but Hallam, unable to resist a personal touch, had slightly amended the recipe. He grinned with satisfaction as he began to screw the rail back into position. A car's wheels scraped to a halt on the gravel outside. He tensed. Surely that couldn't be Verity, not yet. He ran to the window. It was. He could see the high-slung silver rear of the BMW cut down below. Once again, panic coursed through his limbs, but he had to finish the job. There was still time. She would be occupied with the flowers for a start, he hoped. He jumped back up onto the side of the bath and tightened the last screw just as the first scream of outrage echoed up from downstairs. Goose pimples rose all over Hallam's exposed skin as he scooped up his equipment and made for the door. Pausing only to look back and check that he had not forgotten anything, he tiptoed to the bedroom door to hear what was going on downstairs and access his options for escape. He heard the fury in Verity's stamping footsteps downstairs as she raged at the secretary. "You stupid woman, how could you let someone bring these flowers into the house?" "But I didn't see the problem. My allergy. Didn't Julius tell you?" "Verity, believe me, I had no idea. Get them out, right now. Get Carl. Why didn't he say anything?" She groaned. "It's coming on already." Hallam heard her panting experimentally, followed by the hiss of an asthma inhaler. Then the back door opened and Verity fled outside. More footsteps clip-clopped rapidly down the hallway, accompanied by the rustle of flowers being carried out by the armfuls towards the back door. The process was repeated for over 3 minutes while Hallam looked around desperately for somewhere he could hide in case Verity took refuge upstairs. He heard Carl's voice by the back door now, trying to calm her down. "Who would have sent them?" she cried. "Who would do this?" "Is there a card or something?" asked Carl. "I don't know. Go and look." Hallam heard Carl's footsteps circle the hallway. Then they stopped before heading hastily back outside. Hallam crept up to the top of the stairs. Perhaps if he made a dash through the front door. "Are they all out?" he heard Verity ask the door. "Yes," said the secretary. "Have you opened all the windows downstairs?" "I'll do that now. I'm going upstairs. You didn't put any upstairs, did you?" "No." A moan and 3 puffs of the inhaler. "I've got to lie down." Hallam retreated to the bedroom. Where should he go? Where could he hide? All the doors to the other rooms were shut apart from her bedroom, and he had barely 10 seconds to make a decision. What if the other doors were locked, or if they creaked? What if she checked for more flowers? She was coming up the stairs. There was only one thing for it, the bathroom cupboards. Hallam skidded back into the master bedroom, dropped the depilatory cream, picked it up again, and ran through the bathroom. The equipment crushed to his bare chest. With his free hand he opened the first full-length cupboard. It was filled with drawers. No good. He heard Verity reach the top of the stairs. He tried the second. It was filled with shelves laden with unguents, bath crystals, and soaps. No good. He tried the third. He heard Verity enter the bedroom. A clothes rail containing a couple of light dressing gowns and a Japanese kimono. Hallam stepped in and reached out for the cupboard door. The cream slipped from his grasp again. He managed to catch it between his knees, and in its comic pose sank into a crouch and softly shut himself in. A moment later he heard Verity bustle into the bathroom. A silence. Had she noticed something? The smell, perhaps, or some smudges of coal dust on the cupboard mirror? Had he forgotten the sausage wrapping? No, it was there in his hands, greasy, the sweet stench filling the stuffy confines of his hiding place. He heard a sigh, then a vigorous scraping sound which he realized was Verity brushing her hair. Vanity even in the midst of crisis. Perhaps she sought to calm herself, perhaps it would help her think. Then there was the clunk of the toilet seat going down, the hiss of tights and knickers on a brisk descent. Oh no, Hallam thought. I don't want to hear this. A second later he heard the quiet piddle of urine in the pan. It sounded so vulnerable, how completely at odds with this human private function was with the iconic status that he had given her, his inverted mother figure, his nemesis. Right now she was nothing more than a woman sitting on a toilet, her guard utterly down. He then realized why he was here. His desire to kill Verity had always been present among a crowd of hopeless desires that had filled his hours in Edinburgh, but he had never thought to single it out until now, since he no longer sanctioned denial. What was stopping him? Civilization? He thought back 5 years to the teenagers gathered around the display cabinet of combat knives in the army surplus store, and began to understand the nature of their fascination. In the gloom of the cupboard, Hallam's knuckles whitened experimentally around the screwdriver. What if he burst out of the cupboard right now and punched that little taut stretch of skin between her eyes with the point of the tool? Wasn't that what he was here to do? To act? To kill? It had all the deadly symmetry that he could desire. His years had been spent outside in real life, and he had been exiled from it by this woman. It was she who had condemned him to be an observer. This would be his triumphant return to the world of participation, breaking back into life again at the expense of hers. Wasn't that what he wanted? No. It was not just about personal grievance, it was on behalf of the dead. He must do it for the right reasons, without undue emotion, in the rational manner of a legal execution at the appointed time. Retribution, yes, that was the word he had chosen. Verity blew her nose with a painful sob. The toilet flushed, a rush of water in the basin, and then she went out. Her footsteps passed along the landing towards a stairwell and then down. Hallam's body relaxed by a degree, then another. It was too late to kill her now, but also he reflected too soon. "You're fired," he heard Verity scream downstairs, followed by a sneeze. "Now get out." His immediate concern was to escape without detection. The roof? He could wait until nightfall and come down a drainpipe, but then he remembered that he would have to retrieve his clothing on the cellar steps or run the risk of Julie's discovering them on his way to get some wine. He couldn't leave evidence like that lying around. Amid the salvos of calculation, Hallam's fretting suddenly fell silent. He realized that his escape could be perfectly simple. He waited until he heard Verity go outside, then he calmly stepped out of the cupboard, paraded the length of the landing, and strolled down the stairs with perfect self-assurance. Like a duchess, he thought triumphantly. It was a precious moment, that leisurely descent in his underpants, while just down the hall he could hear the secretary picking up her belongings, and the sound of Verity outside berating Carl in a totally unjustified manner for not having intercepted the flower delivery man. Hallam felt exhausted but placid. He had the same sensation of utter confidence that he had experienced the night he visited Alistair's bedroom. He was now intimately reacquainted with his subject, and with that his talent for being invisible had returned. He had regained the hall. He did not hurry to reach the cellar steps, although he was only seconds away from being discovered by Verity, who came stamping through on her way back upstairs, snuffling and gasping with the onset of her allergy. He softly shut the cellar door behind him and put his clothes back on, warned by the thought that there was so much more fun to come. He settled down in the cellar to wait until nightfall. His self-confidence did not extend as far as risking detection from Carl in broad daylight. Now that he had been put on full alert, he was in no hurry, and besides, he quite liked it down here despite the cold. It made a change to the underneath his subjects for once. He decided to select a bottle from his father's rack, but which one? As usual, he fell back on the dictates of his superstitious lexicon. With the aid of his torch, he counted 11 rows along, 8 up, and pulled out what looked like a rather smart bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. It seemed a little too chilled in his hands, but his father's taste in wine was persnickety as he remembered it. The vintage was likely to be superb. He pushed the cork through the screwdriver, taking pleasure from the thought of how much this would annoy his father were he here to see it. Then he raised the bottle and silently toasted himself in the success of the first phase of the operation. Hallam had scooped out a primitive recliner in the pile of coal and was approaching the bottom of the bottle by the time he heard Julia's return. His father must have had other business in town, being back this late. He went straight upstairs to see his wife, who had Hallam guessed already gone to bed. Now was the perfect opportunity. Hallam took one last pull on the bottle and got a mouthful of dregs. Gagging, he tossed the bottle away in disgust, and it skidded across the coals before hitting the wall with a tinkle of breaking glass. Hallam spat. Still, they wouldn't have heard that upstairs. He got up with difficulty and grabbed his rucksack, then fixed his unsteady gaze, now accustomed to the dark, however, on the chute. Then he had a thought. He returned to the wine rack and picked at random another bottle, which he put in the rucksack for later. Now he was ready. Scrambling over the coal, he put one foot on the lip of the chute and searched for a handhold. Not so easy getting back up. He took a couple of steps back on the coal pile and attempted to run up. As a mounting procedure, it should have been a dismal failure, but somehow his drunken lunge enabled his tough fingertips to find purchase on the welded joint. With his nose painfully pressed against the dusty metal, arms at full stretch, and knees painfully lodged against the sides, he managed to inch a leg up or two and wedge himself in. Slowly he pulled himself out, the rucksack causing much inconvenience, until eventually he was able to open the chute's metal lid and taste fresh air. He flopped onto the concrete, panting from the exertion, and let the lid down softly. He remembered to replace the padlock before deciding to return indirectly to the church via the front lawns, for fear of passing the back door, where he knew a security light would be activated by any movement. He went by the dustbins and caught a whiff of fresh flowers. The stem of one red rose hung out forlornly from one of the bins. Passing through the trees on the drive, he looked up at the front of the hall and saw the shadow of his father in the master bedroom through a gap in the shutters. Hallam groggily pondered the great myth of privacy, threw one arm in a grandiose manner, and then let out a thunderous belch that might have passed for a sigh in Pig City, but was louder than he had anticipated. This was immediately followed by a short but distinct shuffle from the shrubbery not far away. Had he imagined that? Hallam sank back into the shadows of the nearest tree as swiftly as he could manage and waited. Nothing. Very slowly he backed himself against a tree trunk, looking all around him. More nothing. He could reach the path to the church now without any difficulty, but the risk of being spotted was too high, and he might lead Carl or whoever it was in that bush to discover the center of operations. But surely it couldn't be Carl. He would never be so stupid as to let himself be heard when he was staked out under cover. It had to be someone else. Hold on, thought Hallam. Perhaps it was one of the local vandals. Of course. Filled with supreme confidence, Hallam strode across the lawn and stood right by the large shrub. He thought he could see a pair of feet inside it. "Hello?" whispered Hallam in as unthreatening a manner as he could. There was no answer. He tugged one of the bigger branches like a bell pull. "Anybody in?" "It's only me." A tiny rustle, then an adolescent's curse and the sounds of a scuffle. "Who's me?" came a tight little whisper from the shrub. Hallam felt F, the crush of branches being fought through, and the small figure burst out, heading for the drive. "No, you've got it wrong," shouted Hallam as quietly as he could. "I'm on your side." A second figure broke out of the shrubbery, but hesitated. It turned out to be a boy of about 14. Hallam tried to smile reassuringly. "Are you the lad from the lake?" the boy asked. Hallam thought about this. "I suppose so, yes." The boy nodded in the direction of the companion, currently hovering by the gate. It was his older brother that saw you in there. He was on a dare. Nobody had the guts to go back for ages until Nuss. Hallam remembered all those years ago, the figure fleeing across the fields as he had pulled himself out of the lake. Is it true you eat roadkills? No. There was an uncomfortable pause. The boy's companion waved to him urgently. Right, I'm off. Hallam thought about asking him to keep his quiet. There did not seem much point. The boy jogged away. Hallam looked back at the windows of the hall, then slipped away himself, mindful that Carl or Julius could have been drawn by the noise. He would have to get a move on. Hallam opened his eyes and fought his way out of his sleeping bag, reaching just short of the low wall. He emptied the meager contents of his stomach into the rain gutter in 3 wine-reddened heaves. As he slumped onto his side, gasping, he heard his vomit begin to drip onto the path from the gaping mouth of the gargoyle. He pulled the second empty wine bottle from under his back, where he had let it roll last night. Maybe the extended nightcap hadn't been such a good idea. He opened his weeping eyes and looked up at the sky, which was gray with a solid and seemingly immobile block of cloud. He groaned, shifted his foul tongue around his mouth, and wished that he had remembered to fill up the water bottle. His bladder was uncomfortably heavy with urine, so he got on his knees and began to pee away the streaks of sick from the rain gutter, causing the gargoyle to emit a further stream of even more disgusting waste. He crawled back to his sleeping bag and had just wearily wriggled back inside when he heard the creak of a gate from the estate side of the cemetery, followed by approaching footsteps. Peering carefully down, Hallam saw the vicar on her way back to unlock the church. He prayed that she would not notice the puddle of vomit and pee on the path, and then look up to see the slaver dripping from the gargoyle's lower lip. As it happened, she did not. She stopped to pick up a few stray pieces of litter from the grass, and then passed out of sight into the main entrance. Hallam heard the heavy lock being turned as the oak door swung open, at which point he noticed movement on the hall's drive. A red van on its way up. The emergency plumber. Presumably he had been called to check on the drains. The chipolatas were doing their job already. If all went to plan, the smell in the bathroom continued to worsen. Julius would perhaps call someone to check in under the floorboards for the source of the stench. Pest control would be summoned on the lookout for rats or similar rotting vermin, and ultimately, as the stench crept into their bedroom where Verity might still be laid up with her allergy, they could conceivably be forced to call in the vicar and attempt an exorcism. Tee-hee. Until the sausages were discovered, however, there would be no firm evidence that she was being persecuted. The mystery of those serial misfortunes would provide a valuable psychological dimension. Hallam wondered whether Verity had washed her hair yet. Once the vicar had gone on her way again, Hallam started to feel better. It occurred to him that he might check his telephone answering service. Making himself more comfortable against the rucksack, he turned on his mobile phone and tapped in the number. The first one was from Lucy, sounding impatient. Hallam, where are you? Give me a ring as soon as you get this. Bye. The second was from Kate. Hallam, what the F did you think you were doing? I sincerely hope you weren't trying to impress me. You need to call me, Hallam. We've got to deal with this, not least the work situation. You can't just walk away, and besides, what about me, you son of a... Call me. No. This call provided shallow amusement for Hallam now. All of this chaos was happening in another world. The next call from Lucy sounded more panicked. What's going on here, Hallam? Where are you? I just tried to talk to Kate, but she was being very weird. She doesn't seem to have a clue where you are. Look, I'm sorry about some of the stuff that was said last night. Don't take it too hard, and don't go and do something stupid. I'm going to try to work again. I love you. Please call me. He snorted at the cutesy declaration of attachment. Next, surprise, surprise, it was Kate again. He could tell this immediately from the short sigh of self-restraint that began the message. Hallam, I really need your help on this Carter matter. I really believe we can sort it out as long as you call me soon. Also, I want you to know that I want to hear your voice telling me that you're okay. Please, call me any time. Lots of love. More rational sounding this one, even an attempt to appear as if she cared about him. She must be getting desperate. Hallam wondered what sort of conference Lucy and Kate had had together, what had been revealed, and what temporary grievance bedeviled alliance that may have hammered out. Lucy must have greater powers of charm than he had given her credit for if Kate managed to forgive her the many disturbing implications of those photographs. Either that, or Kate was under serious pressure from lawyers and superiors at work. She always became more polite when matters turned urgent. Hallam grinned. In a perverse way, he was beginning to enjoy all this attention from the women in his life. Then he realized that this was not a perverse response at all in the eyes of normal people, or according to the therapy-influenced analyses that Lucy doubtless subscribed to. It was an utterly explicable low-grade human desire for attention. Since when had he started to enjoy attention from women? He used to shrivel at the idea of them even looking at him. Since when had he started to act or respond like other people? It was a genuinely worrying development. He knew all too well what this normal subjects got up to behind their closed doors and open windows. He had compiled simply too much evidence for them to be considered anything like suitable role models. He would have to consider these and other pressing issues in more detail later, once he got his job out of the way. One more message Hallam was expecting. Lucy again, but instead he was startled by the foppish tones of Alistair. "Good day there, Hallam. How are you?" "Me, I'm still a wee bit sore after that extravagant sexual pummeling, but wonderfully satisfied nevertheless. I must say your sister confirmed the old adage that the mad ones are better in bed. Not that much of it was in the bed, though. Eh, old chap? Anyway, I must get on, but I wanted to check that you enjoyed the performance. We aim to please. Arrivederci, dear boy. And if you have any other effed up relatives needing to be effed, then you know who to call." 2 beats followed. Hallam turned off the mobile and frowned. He picked up his trusty laces and weighed them in his hand, then leant back and trained them on the old weather vane above him, which had rested solid, which indicated a northeasterly wind. Now decades passed. He never failed to enjoy the crisp clarity of the German optics. The sound of building work up at the back lakes rumbled down during the morning, but Hallam was prevented from going up to observe because the lack of cover in the full light of day. He had to keep his distance, even at night. There was a high risk that Carl would be skulking nearby, and he did not want to test his old friend's loyalty once again, especially since the plagues in the hall must surely have raised suspicion in his mind. The siege mentality of the hall, already well established before Hallam's return, and the crisis within made him wary about venturing into the grounds at all. However, the arrival of a car containing what Hallam thought to be a doctor, and the fact that Verity had not shown herself out of doors all day, when her habit was to oversee Carl's work, much to his irritation, indicated that his depilatory gambit could well have paid off. He shuddered deliciously at the nastiness of his actions, and savored his powers of malevolent ingenuity. Where did he get it from? His hangover made Hallam realize that he had not eaten for a very long time. Food was a problem because he did not want to show his face in the village, nor did he want to walk the few miles or so to the next one and risk running into someone he knew, or missing some development back at base. He could easily last another day or so, and that was all he needed. That afternoon Hallam idly played his laches over the estate, and noticed a net curtain being peeled back at the pensioners' maisonette at the top of the road. He could see the old lady peer myopically out from her chair by the window, and as she had done ever since her stroke 6 years before. Brisk entries in Hallam's logbook all that time ago, written down during dull periods of observation, testified to this. He had given it little thought at the time, but now he considered how interminably long the retirement years dragged on in the modern world. For all the changes at the hall in his own life, this old woman's patterns had remained exactly the same. Perhaps that was what everyone's fate in the end was, if they lingered into old age, to become a crippled voyeur, positioned by the double aging, driven by incapacity and boredom to feed off the carrion of other people's comings and goings when the misery of TV's daytime schedules drove you away from the screen. At least he would be more prepared for it than most, if he made that far. It was a rental car that had attracted the old lady's attention. It pulled up by the pavement at the top of the road, but the reflection on the windscreen prevented Hallam from seeing in, the door open on the driver's side. Lucy put on her sunglasses and stretched her back. The passenger door opened and came out, and out came Kate. She squinted up at the church and then looked over towards the grounds of the hall. Hallam remained absolutely still. The two of them made their way through the church gate. Kate was aiming straight for the church itself, obviously curious, but Lucy tapped her elbow with the two of them headed down the path and led directly to the grounds. What was going on? Had Lucy phoned Julius? That question was answered almost immediately when first Lucy and Kate ducked out of sight, presumably having seen someone come around the other side of the hall. It was not the reaction of lunch guests. Lucy rose up on tiptoe and peered over the ledge toward the lawns. Then the pair of them crept past the war memorial and down the public path. Once they were out of sight, Hallam trotted down the steeple's thin metal ladder and slipped out of church, temporarily abandoning caution. He ran down the hall's private gate and vaulted over it, then slipped down the covered path through the shrubbery, which opened out onto southwest traverse. From here he could see Carl right on the far side of the lawns, patiently making his way along the lawn edges with a strimmer. The whine of the motor over that distance acquired a strangely disembodied sound. Then it stopped. Carl had turned off the strimmer and was standing straight. He cocked his head in a way that suggested he was listening and then went over to the fence. It had to be Lucy. Perhaps she was checking with Carl to see whether he had seen Hallam anywhere. And the chances were that Carl would tell the truth, particularly if she gave him her own version of events. There was no way Hallam could get close enough to hear what was being said, and he felt impotent rage at the thought of Lucy turning Carl against him. Hallam's fuming was interrupted by approaching footsteps on the path, and he had to slip the other side of the shrub and sink into it to avoid being seen. He immediately recognized the ambling footsteps. The slip of the lighter confirmed that it was Julius in one of his smoking expeditions. He would most likely be heading down towards the pond, quite possibly looking to chat with Carl. This would be the first time that Hallam had seen his father up close in 5 years. It was something of an anticlimax. As Julius passed just feet away, Hallam could only see the back of his father's head, which was marginally grayer than before. Other than that, his figure and gait had barely changed. The waft of Panatella smoke drifted back with the light breeze. Even the brand of tobacco was the same. Hallam made his break and quickly ducked back down the path Julius had emerged from, keeping to the verge for the sake of silence. Then he saw Carl pack back into sight and spot Julius. Carl guiltily looked at his feet, wiped his hands on his trousers, and picked up the strimmer again. Hallam squinted back to the church. He climbed up the ladder to the bell chamber, and pulled himself up onto the roof just in time to see Lucy and Kate making their way back up the path toward the car. They came to the fork that led either to the church or the small car park. Kate stopped. "Can we have a quick look around? I love these old village cemeteries." Lucy looked at her watch, then shrugged. "Why not? There's not much else we can do for the time being." "If that was your dad, why didn't you say hello?" asked Kate. "I don't want to explain why we're here." "Doesn't he have a right to know?" "I don't see why." They started to walk again. "I can't believe that Hallam's capable of violence," said Kate. "Of course he is," snapped Lucy. "He's unstable, isn't he?" "Why, thank you, dear sister," thought Hallam. Although she was right, of course. The two women stepped around the dried remains of Hallam's sick on the path. "You don't know that," said Kate. "I'm his sister, and I'm his boss. He resigned. He absconded." The two women stopped, stared hard at each other. Lucy poked her finger at Kate. "I want to help Hallam. You just want to track him down so you can use him as a scapegoat for his writ." Kate scowled. "That is," she paused, "partially untrue. My prime motive is to find him safe, then give him a good bullocking." They continued to tour the cemetery, performing a full circle round the church. Hallam followed them from above, passing silently from griffin to gargoyle to griffin. "I get first go," said Lucy. "I can't believe he had to show you the photo with my nose pressed against the window pane. It was completely unnecessary. I thought he caught your likeness rather well," said Kate sweetly. "Was it your first date?" Lucy shrugged. "It was the only thing Alasdair seemed good for. Hallam wasn't even good for that." Hallam flinched. Kate seemed to regret her presumably unpremeditated reaction. She looked away as Lucy processed the information. "So that's what this is about," said Lucy at last. Kate kept quiet. Lucy batted Kate's shoulder with the heel of a hand. Kate didn't react. "You're worse than I am," said Lucy. 22 years old, your direct subordinate, at work." "At least we didn't do it in a hotel window," Kate muttered. Lucy's eyes narrowed. "Is he in love with you?" "It didn't mean anything. He said it was fine. He said he didn't want—" Kate faded out. Up on the roof, a single tear of shame ran down Hallam's cheek. "If you're suggesting that I'm responsible for his actions," Kate blustered. But she lacked impetus and capitulated instead. "Okay, so it was a mistake. We're even." There was a pause, and Lucy held up her hands. "Let's just try to make sense of it. It might help us find where he is." Kate sighed and ran a finger along the inscription of a plaque mounted on a tomb. "He may have just dropped by on a quick visit." "When was it that Carl said he saw him? A couple of nights ago?" So Carl had informed on him. Hallam found himself betrayed from every direction. "Yeah, but I've just got this feeling." Lucy paused, as if sniffing the air, and Kate stopped too in front of another plaque. Kate frowned and stooped to read it. "Anne Foe." She straightened up and turned to Lucy. "Anne Foe?" "Mother," said Lucy matter-of-factly. "Suicide, or misadventure if you prefer." Kate looked closely at Lucy. Lucy, it seemed, just stood there, but she had her back to Hallam, and he could not see his sister's expression. Kate put her hand up to Lucy's face. Lucy inclined her head slightly. They stood like that for a while. Hallam was moved and also very jealous. He wasn't ready when Lucy suddenly twisted round and looked up at the church. He dropped out of sight and waited, breathless. "What is it?" asked Kate. A silence. "Nothing," answered Lucy. Let's get something to eat. We'd better think about arranging some kind of surveillance. Hallam heard their footsteps return to the car. He did not move until he heard the engine start up and disappear down the road, and then he shook his head. Amateurs. As early evening came on, Hallam saw Carl through the trees, loading shovels and other garden equipment into the tractor trailer, tidying up in preparation for going home. The builders had already packed up for the day, and great peacefulness descended on the grounds. Even the fantails, floating back in towards the dovecote from their trees and perches, did not inspire the usual disgust in Hallam. He had always loved this time of day, but now, of course, it was poisoned like everything else. Carl climbed into the tractor and started the engine up, but then strangely turned it off again. He stepped down and wandered over to the far side of the grounds near the main gate. With his back to Hallam, he put his fingers to his mouth. Hallam strained to hear his call, but the whine of a car passing through the village prevented him. Carl then walked up towards where Hallam was hiding, behind a collection of large rhododendron bushes, and again put his fingers in his mouth. What came out was their call of old, a long piercing bird cry that started as a low throb and ended as a staccato series of chirrups. He paused, waiting for a reply. Instinctively, Hallam's hands went to his mouth, the fingers forming their old pattern. His desire to respond was almost overwhelming. Then he smiled ruefully and let his hands drop. Carl waited for longer than seemed necessary, then returned to his tractor. After nightfall, Hallam made his way down from the church, safe in the knowledge that he was not being observed by Kate or Lucy. He had watched with amusement when their stakeout was cut short by the arrival of a police-cod car, which had been called by the granny and the maisonette, who must have thought they were girl burglars casing properties in the area. After questioning, their names had been taken down, and they were told to clear off. This they did, cheeks burning to shame, as one or two other neighbors peered out with hostile curiosity from the gardens and front doors. Lucy must have lied about her identity, not wanting Julius to know she was there.